This is the lesson for 12-6, day 2. What you're starting to do today is solving quadratic equations. Now, if you take a look at all three of these different problems, these are all solving quadratic equations. How do I know that it's a quadratic? Well, it has the x squared or n squared. What you're going to be doing is the opposite of squaring a number is to take the square root of a number, all right? So remember that the square root is a little check mark deal, all right? So the opposite of squaring a number is to take the square root of a number. This strategy is especially good when there is no bx term, all right? So what you're going to do in these problems today is you're going to try and get rid of that squared first by taking the square root of both sides. Just like when you solve a normal equation, whatever you do to one side of the equal sign, you have to do to the other side of the equal sign. Make sure that whenever you take the square root, remember that there is a plus or minus sign in front of it, all right? So remember, like when we go to take the square root and take the square root, remember that the square root of 25 is really plus or minus 5. So the square root of n squared, the squaring a number and taking the square root are just opposites of each other. So when you take the square root of a square, it's just that same letter, all right? So n squared just turns into n. So we have n equals plus or minus 5. And that would be our answer. Now, you do have to be careful because half of your questions on your homework today say to put your answer in simplest radical form, just like we did yesterday. And half of the answers say to put it in decimal form. Now, on the Regents exam and things like that, you really need to pay attention to whether it says to round to the nearest 10th or round to the nearest 100th or the nearest 1000th or whatever. On today's homework and on today's notes, we are going to round all of the questions to the nearest 10th. But on the notes here, we're going to do answers both ways each time. So take a look at this middle example. X squared equals 72. So the first thing that you want to do, the opposite of squaring a number, is to take the square root of a number. So again, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So we have to take the square root of both sides. So all we end up with is x equals. And now if we are going to put this in simplest radical form, all right, you have to think of what times what is 72. Now remember, there's a couple different ways that we could do this, but the larger perfect square that you use, the less steps there will be involved. Yes, you could use 9 times 8, but it's easier to do 36 times 2. 36 is the largest perfect square that goes into it. So cross off the 36, bring out the 6. So this is really x equals plus or minus 6 radical 2. This would be our answer in simplest radical form. Now, to get it in decimal form, you could do it one of two ways. You could just type in the square root of 72. Oops, I don't want to type it into my y equals. Sorry, I was doing something else. So we could type in the square root of 72 and hit equals. Or you can also type in 6, second button, square root button 2. Notice that we got 6 radical 2. Here's 6 radical 2. Hit enter. Notice that it is the same exact thing. Now remember that it is plus or minus. The nice thing about when you take the square roots and put them in decimal form, if I did -6 square root of 2, so -6 radical 2, it's that same exact decimal. That will happen all of the time. So you never have to worry about that when the negative sign is outside. So if we were going to put it in decimal form, we would have x equals plus or minus. If we were rounding to the nearest 10th, all right, rounding to the nearest 10th, that would be -8.5. All right. So y equals plus or minus, not -8.5. I was looking at the bottom one. Y equals plus or minus 8.5. All right, y equals plus or minus 8.5. So that is your answer in simplest radical form. This is your answer rounded to the nearest 10th. Let's take a look at the next one. N squared equals 41. So putting it in simplest radical form, well, the problem with this one is when you go to take the square root, 41 is a prime number. There isn't any perfect squares that what times what equals 41. So in simplest radical form, this would just be n equals plus or minus the square root of 41. 41 can't be simplified. So this would be your answer in simplest radical form. The square root of 41 is, when rounded to the nearest 10th, 6.4. So in decimal form, it would be plus or minus 6.4. So those would be our two different answers. Again, the directions are very specific. They will either say put it in simplest radical form or put it as a decimal rounded to the nearest 10th. Now, we get a little bit more complicated with the equations that we have to solve. When you see parentheses like this and a squared after it, the first thing that we want to do is get rid of those parentheses and get rid of the squared. So the opposite of squaring a number is to take the square root of a number. Again, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So we're taking the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of m minus 2 squared, it's just going to get rid of that squared. So on this side, we just have m minus 2. On the other side, we have the square root of 25. The square root of 25 is plus or minus 5. Now, here's where it gets a little bit complicated. Now we're at our second bullet. What you're actually going to do, you need to solve it twice. The reason that you need to solve it twice is because the plus or minus. We need to use it once using the positive square root and once using the negative square root. So what you're going to do when it gets to the plus or minus part is you're going to split it into two separate problems. What we really have here is m minus 2 equals 5, and we have m minus 2 equals negative 5, because these are going to be two very different answers. So now you have to solve each one of these equations. So solving this one-step equation, we would do plus 2 and plus 2. So we would have m equals 7. Here we would do plus 2 and plus 2. And we have m equals negative 3. So those would be our two answers for this question. Let's take a look at another one. Now, in this one, we had a one-step equation because it was just m minus 2. This time, notice what we have in parentheses is sort of like the beginning of a two-step equation. So the first step is to get rid of that squared by taking the square root and square root. So all that we have here is 2n plus 3 equals, now the square root of 49 is 7. So it's plus or minus 7. Now that we got down to this part, now we need to separate it into two separate problems. We're going to have 2n plus 3 equals 7. And we're going to have 2n plus 3 equals negative 7. It's two separate problems because of the plus or minus here. So now solving this two-step equation, minus 3 minus 3. So 2n equals 4. Divide by 2, divide by 2. And you get an answer of n equals 2. Here, we're going to do minus 3 and minus 3. Now, because of that negative, we have 2n equals negative 10 when we subtract 3. Divide by 2, divide by 2, and we get n equals negative 5. So there are two separate answers here because of the plus or minus. Now, we didn't put these in simplest radical form because our square root was a perfect square. All right. So what happens if it's not a perfect square? Well, let's do one like we did in the beginning first. All right. If you have something as easy as this one, we would take the square root, take the square root. So the square root of x squared is just x. And then 28. 28 is not a perfect square, so we need to simplify it. What times what is 28, with one of the terms being a perfect square? Well, 4 times 7, 4 is a perfect square. 4 times 7 is 28. Cross off the 4, bring out the 2. So this is plus or minus 2 radical 7. That would be our answer in simplest radical form. Our answer in decimal form, if we type in 2 radical 7, we get 5.3. All right, so we would have x equals plus or minus 5.3. And again, you could have just typed in the square root of 28 as well, because that would give you the same answer. So these do get a little bit more complicated. This one is definitely more complicated. So the first thing that we want to do is get rid of the squared. So we want to take the square root and take the square root. So when we take the square root, what we're left with over here is 10 minus x. And then we have the square root of 12. The square root of 12 is not a perfect square, but 12 can be broken down to be 4 times 3. So 4 is a perfect square. Cross off the 4, bring out the 2. So we have 2 square root of 3. So 2 radical 3. Now that you have the plus or minus there, now we need to split it into 2 separate problems. 10 minus x equals 2 radical 3, and 10 minus x equals negative 2 radical 3. So if we are going to solve this, now this gets a little bit complicated, so make sure that you're paying attention. This is the hardest type of problem that you have today. We need to solve for x. We need to get that x all by itself. So if we were just solving a normal equation, what we would do is minus 10 and minus 10. Bring down your negative x, all right? Bring down your equal sign. You cannot subtract radicals like this. You can't do 2 radical 3 minus 10. It's not like negative 8 radical 10, all right? If you're thinking that's what the answer is, you can't subtract the 10 from just the 3. 2 radical 3 minus 10 just stays 2 radical 3 minus 10. You can't subtract a radical and a plain number. But now we're not done solving this one yet. There's really a negative 1 in front of the x. So to get the x all by itself, we need to divide by negative 1 and divide by negative 1. When we divide by negative 1, we need to do each of these terms divided by negative 1, all right? We need to do the 2 radical 3 divided by negative 1 and the negative 10 divided by negative 1, each one individually. So 2 radical 3 divided by negative 1 is negative 2 radical 3. And negative 10 divided by negative 1, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So this would be our answer. On the other half, what we want to do is we want to try and get the x all by itself again. So again, I have to do minus 10 and minus 10. Those 10s cancel out. So I have negative x equals, I can't do a radical minus a plain number. So I'm just going to rewrite it. Negative 2 radical 3 minus 10. Divide by, there's really a 1 in front of that. So divide by negative 1 and divide by negative 1. Just like on the other side, we have to divide each individual term by the negative 1. Those cancel out. So we have x equals, negative divided by a negative is a positive this time. So we have positive 2 radical 3. Negative divided by a negative is a positive or plus 10. So that ends up being our answer there in simplest radical form. If they ask you to put it as a decimal, there are 2 different ways that you could do it. You could change this into a decimal right away, all right? Instead of doing even the radical right here, you could type in the square root of 12 and use 3.5. All right, you could use 3.5 right there. Or you could do it at the very end. If we do it at the very end, we would have negative 2 radical 3. Now, here's where you need to be careful on the calculator, and this is what I was talking about yesterday. Notice what happens if we type in negative 2 radical 3 and you just put plus 10. Notice where the plus 10 is on my calculator. Notice that the plus 10 is underneath the square root. Is this plus 10 underneath the square root? No, it's not. It's after the square root. So this, if you type this into the calculator how I have it right now, that would be wrong. All right. I need to go back and I need to get rid of that. So we have negative 2 radical 3. Notice how it has this little arrow pointing over to the right. You need to use the arrow pad to get out of the radical. All right. You need to use the right arrow pad to get out of the radical there and then do plus 10. Notice how now my plus 10 is outside of the radical, just like I had it before. So now our answer is x equals 6.5 if we round it to the nearest 10th. On the other side, I have 2 radical 3. And if you don't want to type it in all at once, that's fine. You could do 2 radical 3, hit enter, and then just add 10 to it. And we get our answer of 13.5. So our two answers in decimal form would be 6.5 and 13.5. It all depends on how they ask the question as to how you solve it. So let me do one more, and then I'll have you try this last one on your own. All right, so let me do this one for you. So first thing that you want to do is get rid of the squared. We get rid of the squared by taking the square root and square root. So that leaves us with x plus 5 equals, now if we were doing it in simplest radical form, 50 can be simplified. 50 is really 25 times 2, 25 being our perfect square. Cross off the 25, bring out the 5. So this ends up being plus or minus 5 radical 2. So now you want to split it into 2. We have x plus 5 equals 5 radical 2. And we have x plus 5 equals negative 5 radical 2. We want to get the x all by itself. So I would do minus 5 and minus 5. So our final answer in simplest radical form would be 5 radical 2 minus 5. That would be our positive answer there. And then we have minus 5 and minus 5. Again, you can't do a radical minus a whole number like this. So this is x equals negative 5 radical 2 minus 5. Those would be our two answers. However, if you wanted to put it in decimal form, all right, I could type these right into the calculator. I could do 5 radical 2. Make sure that you move your tab out if you're going to type it in all at once, minus 5. So our positive answer would be, or one answer would be x equals, this would round to be 2.1. Over here, I have negative 5 radical 2. And then minus 5. Whoops, I need to get it outside of that radical. So I need to use the arrow pad to get out. Minus 5 and hit enter. And I get x equals negative 12.1. Go ahead. This one is the last one. Go ahead and try this one on your own, please. Do it both ways, simplest radical form and as a decimal. They give you about 30 seconds more or so. So the first thing that you need to do is to take the square root and take the square root. By taking the square root, it gets rid of those parentheses and the squared. So we have x minus 4 equals, and now we have the square root of 20. 20 is really 4 times 5. Cross off the 4, bring out the 2. So this is plus or minus 2 radical 5. So here's where you need to split it into 2 separate problems. We have x minus 4 equals 2 radical 5, and we have x minus 4 equals negative 2 radical 5. When we go to solve this, we want to try and get the x all by itself. So plus 4 plus 4. Remember, you cannot add together your radical and your whole number like that. So this just stays 2 radical 5 plus 4. On the other side, we do plus 4 and plus 4. So we have x equals negative 2 radical 5 plus 4. Again, we can't add those together, so it just stays like that. 2 radical 5 plus 4. 2 radical 5. You got to tab out of the square root. Plus 4 equals, if we were going to round it to the nearest tenth, this one would give us 8.5 if we were rounding to the nearest tenth. And negative 2 radical 5. You got to tab out of the square root. Plus 4 equals, it looks like it equals negative 0.5. So those would be our 2 answers here. All right, so you got to make sure that you read the directions, whether you're rounding to the nearest tenth or whether you are leaving it in simplest radical form.